Get a job and stop being a leech." My daughter-in-law snapped, her voice cutting through the dinner table like a blade. And for a second no one moved, not even my son, who just sat there staring at his plate as if the mashed potatoes held all the answers. And I remember thinking how strange it was that after 32 years of raising him, after every scraped knee, every sleepless night, every dollar I stretched just to make sure he had more than I ever did, this was what it had come to, this quiet, suffocating moment where I was nothing more than an inconvenience in my own home. And yet I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I didn't even raise my voice. I simply folded my hands in my lap and let the silence stretch until it made them uncomfortable. Because what they didn't know, what neither of them had the slightest idea about, was that this moment, this exact insult, was something I had already prepared for. The dining room looked just as it always had, the oak table polished to a soft shine, the same curtains I had picked out a decade ago filtering the evening light. Everything familiar and yet completely new to me now, like I was a guest watching someone else's family fall apart. Ashley leaned back in her chair with that tight little smile she wore when she thought she had won, when she believed she had finally said the thing that would push me out for good, and Daniel still said nothing, not a single word, not even a glance in my direction, just that quiet, obedient stillness that told me everything I needed to know. And that was when I felt it, not anger, not sadness, but something colder, something steadier, a kind of clarity that settled deep in my chest. Because just 24 hours earlier, I had been sitting in a quiet office across town, listening to a man in a gray suit explain documents my husband had put in place long before he passed, documents that neither my son nor his wife had ever bothered to ask about, documents that changed the meaning of every word Ashley had just thrown at me. I reached for my glass of water, took a slow sip, and set it back down with care, my hand steady, my breathing even, and then I looked up at her, really looked at her, not as the woman who had married into my family, but as someone who had just made a very costly mistake. And when I finally spoke, my voice was calm, almost gentle, which seemed to unsettle her more than any anger could have, because I said, "You might want to think about what you just said." And I let that hang there, watching the flicker of confusion cross her face, watching Daniel finally shift in his seat. And in that moment, for the first time all evening, I wasn't the one being judged. I wasn't the one being pushed out. I was the one holding something they didn't understand yet, something that would change everything. And I realized then that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't to fight back right away. It's to let them believe they've already won, right up until the moment you show them they never had a chance. The rest of the dinner passed in a quiet that felt heavier than any argument, the kind of silence that settles into your bones and makes every small movement sound too loud, too deliberate. And I noticed how Ashley avoided looking directly at me after that, how her confidence shifted just slightly, like a crack forming beneath a polished surface, while Daniel kept his eyes down, pushing food around his plate without really eating. And I realized something then that I had been refusing to see for a long time. This was not a sudden moment of cruelty. It was the result of something that had been building slowly, quietly, over months, maybe even years, small changes I had dismissed at the time, like the way Ashley would answer questions meant for Daniel, or how decisions about the house were made without including me, even though I had lived there for over 3 decades. Even though every corner of that place held a memory I had carefully built with my husband, I could still remember the day we moved in, the smell of fresh paint, the way he stood in the doorway smiling like we had just stepped into the life we had always dreamed of. And now I was sitting at the same table feeling like a stranger, like someone who had overstayed her welcome in a place she no longer recognized. When dinner finally ended, Ashley gathered the plates with quick, sharp movements, not asking for help, not acknowledging me at all, and Daniel followed her into the kitchen without a word, their voices low and indistinct behind the half-closed door. I stayed seated for a moment longer, my hands resting lightly on the table, feeling the smooth wood beneath my fingertips, grounding myself in something real, something that still belonged to me in a way they could not erase. Then I stood up and walked slowly to my room, the hallway lights casting long shadows that made the house feel unfamiliar, almost now again, as if it had already begun to reject me. I closed the door behind me and sat on the edge of the bed, looking around at the familiar objects that suddenly felt temporary, like they could be taken away at any moment. And that was when my mind returned to the conversation from the day before, the quiet office, the neatly stacked papers, the calm, measured voice explaining details that now echoed with a different kind of meaning. I had not fully understood the weight of it then, not until tonight, not until I saw the certainty in Ashley's eyes when she spoke, the way she believed she already controlled everything. I reached for my purse, still resting on the chair where I had left it, and carefully took out the folder inside, running my fingers along the edge of the documents without opening them. I did not need to read them again. I already knew what they said, and more importantly, I knew what they meant. Downstairs I could hear the faint sound of cabinets closing, footsteps moving across the kitchen floor, the ordinary sounds of a family continuing their evening as if nothing had shifted, but everything had shifted, just not in the way they thought. I leaned back slightly, letting out a slow breath, and for the first time since my husband passed, I did not feel powerless. I did not feel invisible. Instead, I felt something steady, something controlled, like I had finally stepped into a position where I could see the entire board clearly, and I understood that this was not the moment to act. Not yet, because sometimes the strongest move is patience, sometimes the only way to reveal the truth is to give people enough time to show exactly who they are. And as I sat there in the quiet of my room, holding on to the one thing they did not know existed, I made a simple decision. I would let them continue. I would let them believe their version of the story just a little longer, because when the time came, when everything was laid out in the open, there would be no confusion, no denial, only the undeniable truth of who had been standing on solid ground all along the next. Morning arrived with a quiet that felt almost deliberate, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do, and I moved through my usual routine slowly, methodically, making coffee the way I always had, measuring out exactly 2 scoops, pouring the water, listening to the familiar hum of the machine, because there was something grounding about doing things the same way when everything else had shifted. I could hear Ashley upstairs, her footsteps quick and purposeful, the sound of drawers opening and closing, while Daniel's voice drifted faintly through the hallway. Already on a work call, already somewhere else mentally, and it struck me how easily life continued for them, how little last night had actually changed in their world, or at least how little they believed it had. I sat at the kitchen table with my cup in both hands, letting the warmth settle into my palms, and I noticed small details I had overlooked before, the way the fruit bowl had been moved to the far end of the counter, the new set of keys hanging by the door that I did not recognize, the subtle but undeniable signs that decisions were being made without me, that space was being quietly reorganized as if preparing for my absence. And yet I said nothing. I asked nothing, because now I understood that every one of those details was not just an insult. It was information. Information that told me exactly how far they were willing to go. Ashley came down a few minutes later, dressed neatly, her expression composed, almost pleasant, as if the words from the night before had been nothing more than a passing comment. She greeted me with a brief nod, not quite an apology, not quite an acknowledgement, and moved straight to the refrigerator, taking out items with a sense of ownership that felt both casual and calculated. Daniel followed shortly after, grabbing his briefcase, glancing at me only long enough to say good morning in a tone that lacked any real warmth, and I watched them both carefully, not with anger, but with a kind of detached clarity, because now every gesture, every word, every silence revealed something they had not intended to show. They were comfortable, too comfortable, confident in an outcome they believed was already decided, and that confidence was exactly what I needed, because it meant they would not be careful, they would not question, they would continue exactly as they had been, assuming I was still the same woman who would quietly accept whatever was handed to her. After they left, the house grew still again, but this time the silence felt different, less oppressive, more like an open space waiting to be filled. I stood up and walked slowly through each room, taking in the details, the framed photographs, the furniture we had chosen together, the small imperfections that told the story of a life built over time. And I let myself remember, not with sadness, but with purpose, because this was not just a house. It was a record of everything that had been invested into it, everything that had been promised, and everything that was now being taken for granted. When I returned to the living room, I sat down and finally opened the folder, carefully reviewing each page. not because I needed to, but because I wanted to feel the certainty of it again, the clarity, the quiet strength that came from knowing the truth. And as I read, I could not help but think about the way Ashley had spoken, the certainty in her voice, the assumption that I had nowhere else to go, nothing else to rely on, and I realized that her greatest mistake had not been the insult itself. It had been underestimating me, underestimating the years I had spent learning how to endure, how to observe, how to wait. I closed the folder and set it gently on the table. My decision already made. I would not rush this. I would not confront them in anger or desperation. Instead, I would give them exactly what they expected. I would remain quiet, cooperative, even agreeable, because the more comfortable they became, the more they revealed. And when the time came, when everything was undeniable, there would be no room left for excuses, only the truth standing clearly in front of them. And this time, I would be the one deciding what happened next that afternoon. I found myself standing in the hallway outside the study, a room that had once belonged to my husband in every sense of the word, and I hesitated before stepping inside, because even now, months after he was gone, it still felt like crossing into a space that held his presence, the faint scent of his cologne lingering in the wood and paper, the desk still arranged the way he liked it, everything in its place, deliberate and precise. I walked slowly to the desk and ran my fingers along the surface, remembering the nights he would sit there going over documents, occasionally looking up to smile at me as if to say everything was under control. And for so many years, I had believed that without question, I had trusted that the life we built together was secure, that the foundation beneath us was something that could not be shaken. But now, standing there alone, I realized how much of that security had depended on him being present, on his quiet way of keeping things balanced, of making sure no one crossed certain lines. I opened one of the drawers and found the neatly organized files he had always maintained, labels written in his careful handwriting, dates, categories, everything accounted for. And I thought about how different things had become since he passed, how quickly the tone in this house had shifted, how boundaries had been quietly erased. I pulled out an old photograph tucked between two folders, a picture of the three of us taken years ago, Daniel standing between us, smiling wide, his arm around my shoulder, his father's hand resting firmly on his back. And for a moment, I allowed myself to feel the weight of that memory, not as something to mourn, but as something to understand, because that boy in the photograph was not the man sitting silently at the dinner table anymore. Somewhere along the way, something had changed, or perhaps it had always been there, and I had chosen not to see it. I placed the photograph back and closed the drawer gently, my mind already shifting back to the present, to what needed to be done, because the truth was, I could not rely on memories to protect me. I could not rely on what used to be. I had to deal with what was in front of me now. I moved to the window and looked out at the backyard, the garden we had planted together, now slightly overgrown, as if it too had been neglected in the absence of someone who cared enough to maintain it. And I realized that this house, this life, it had been sustained by effort, by attention, by a quiet kind of dedication that was easy to overlook until it was gone. And perhaps that was what Ashley and Daniel failed to understand. They saw the result, the structure, the comfort, but not the years of work behind it, not the decisions, the sacrifices, the careful planning that had made it possible. And that misunderstanding was exactly what had led them to believe they could simply step in and take control without consequence. I turned away from the window and sat down in the chair behind the desk, the same chair my husband had used for years, and for a moment I allowed myself to sit there, to feel the weight of it, not as a burden, but as a reminder of what had been entrusted to me. Because whether they realized it or not, whether they acknowledged it or not, there were things in motion that they could not see. Things that had been set in place long before Ashley ever walked through that front door. I reached into my bag and took out the folder again, placing it carefully on the desk, and this time I opened it with a sense of purpose, reviewing not just the words, but the implications, the protections that had been written into every line. And I understood now that this was not just about proving them wrong. It was about restoring balance, about making it clear that actions had consequences, that respect was not optional. And as I closed the folder once more, I felt a calm settle over me, not the kind that comes from resignation, but the kind that comes from knowing exactly what needs to be done and having the patience to do it properly. I stood up, straightened the papers on the desk, and took one last look around the room before stepping back into the hallway. Because the next time I walked into that dining room, the next time we all sat across from each other, things would not be the same, not because I would demand it, but because I would no longer allow them to pretend that I was someone they could dismiss without consequence. The following days unfolded with a quiet rhythm that would have seemed ordinary to anyone looking from the outside. But to me, every moment felt deliberate, every word measured, every glance a piece of a larger pattern that was finally becoming clear. I made breakfast as usual, kept the house in order, responded politely when spoken to, and in return I watched carefully as Ashley moved through the space with increasing confidence, her tone sharper. When she spoke about small things, her decisions more assertive, as if she had already stepped into a role that had never been offered to her. Daniel followed her lead without question, agreeing quickly, avoiding conflict, and most telling of all, avoiding me, not out of anger, but out of something quieter, something closer to discomfort, as if a part of him understood that something was not quite right, but chose not to examine it too closely. I noticed how conversations would stop when I entered a room, how certain topics were discussed only when they thought I was out of earshot, and instead of confronting it, I allowed it, because each of those moments confirmed what I had already begun to suspect. They were planning something that involved decisions about this house, about my place in it, decisions they believed they had the authority to make. One afternoon, I overheard Ashley on the phone, her voice low but firm, discussing renovations, timelines, even mentioning the possibility of converting the upstairs bedroom into a nursery, and I stood just out of sight, listening without reacting, because that single conversation told me more than any direct confrontation could have. It told me they were not just imagining a future here, they were acting on it, shaping it, as if my presence was temporary, as if I were already on my way out. Later that evening, Daniel approached me in the living room, his expression carefully neutral, and mentioned in a casual tone that they had been thinking about making some changes to the house. Nothing major, just improvements, updates, things that would make the space more functional. He spoke as though he expected agreement, as though my role was simply to nod and accept, and I did exactly that. I nodded, I listened, I even offered a small smile, because there was no benefit in challenging him yet, not when he was so willing to reveal his assumptions without any pressure. After he left the room, I remained seated for a while, letting the silence settle around me, and I thought about how easily people reveal themselves when they believe they are in control, how quickly they stop being careful when they think the outcome is already decided. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street, the same street where I had watched Daniel ride his bicycle as a child, where neighbors had gathered for holidays, where life had once felt simple and secure, and I understood then that this was not just about a house or a set of documents. It was about perception, about who was seen as having authority and who was not. And for too long I had allowed that perception to shift without correcting it. Not out of weakness, but out of trust. A trust that had clearly been misplaced. I turned away from the window and walked to the small desk in the corner, opening a drawer where I had begun to keep certain papers separate, copies, notes, small but important details that I had started organizing quietly, methodically. Because if there was one thing I had learned over the years, it was that preparation mattered more than reaction, that the right moment, when supported by the right information, could change everything without the need for raised voices or dramatic confrontations. As I reviewed the documents, aligning them neatly, ensuring everything was exactly where it needed to be, I felt that same steady calm settle over me again, not the kind that comes from ignoring a problem, but the kind that comes from understanding it completely, from knowing that while they were making plans based on assumptions, I was preparing based on facts, and when those two things finally met, there would be no confusion about which one would prevail. I closed the drawer and turned off the light, leaving the room just as quietly as I had entered, because for now, silence was still my greatest advantage, and I intended to use it until the moment it was no longer necessary. 2 days later, I made a decision that would have seemed insignificant to anyone else, but to me it felt like setting the first piece of a much larger plan into motion. I picked up the phone and called the one person I knew would not rely on assumptions or emotions, someone who dealt only in facts, in records, in truth that could not be easily dismissed. And when Mr. Harris answered, his voice calm and steady as always, I Introduced myself, even though he already knew exactly who I was. There was a brief pause on the line, the kind that carries weight, the kind that acknowledges unspoken understanding. And then he asked if everything was all right. I told him yes, that everything was exactly as expected, but that I would like to go over the documents once more, just to ensure there were no misunderstandings. He agreed without hesitation and suggested we meet that afternoon, the familiarity of his tone grounding me in a way I had not realized I needed. When I arrived at his office, the same quiet space I had sat in just days before, everything felt sharper, more defined, as if I was seeing it with clearer eyes now. He greeted me with a polite nod and gestured for me to sit, and without wasting time, he opened the folder and began to walk through each detail again, this time more slowly, more deliberately, explaining not just what was written, but what it meant in practical terms, what rights were protected, what authority was granted, and most importantly, what could not be changed without my explicit consent. I listened carefully, asking questions where needed, not because I doubted the information, but because I wanted to understand every angle, every implication, because when the moment came, I intended to speak with complete certainty, not a single word based on assumption. As he finished, he leaned back slightly and studied my expression, as if trying to determine whether I fully grasped the position I was in, and I met his gaze without hesitation, because now I did understand. More than that, I accepted it. I accepted that what had been quietly secured years ago was now something I would need to actively uphold. He asked if there had been any issues at home, and for a brief moment I considered telling him everything, the tension, the assumptions, the way I was being slowly edged out without a single direct conversation. But instead I simply said that I wanted to be prepared, that circumstances had changed, and I preferred clarity over confusion. He nodded as if that was answer enough, because in his line of work, it usually was. Before I left, he handed me a certified copy of the documents, neatly organized, clearly marked, and I held them in my hands with a sense of weight that had nothing to do with the paper itself. It was the weight of certainty, of protection, of something real in a situation that had been built on illusion. When I stepped back outside, the afternoon sun felt warmer than I expected, the air clearer, and for the first time since this quiet shift in my life had begun, I felt not just prepared, but ready, not ready to confront, not yet, but ready to let things unfold exactly as they would. Because now I knew that no matter how far Ashley and Daniel pushed their assumptions, no matter how confidently they acted on plans that excluded me, there was a line they could not cross, a boundary they could not erase. And the moment they reached it, the moment they stepped beyond what they believed was theirs, everything would change. I returned home just before they did, placing the documents carefully back where I knew they would remain, undisturbed. And when I heard the front door open, their voices carrying into the house with the same easy confidence as before, I did not move to greet them. I did not announce my presence. I simply sat where I was, listening, observing, allowing the evening to begin as it always did, because the truth was, nothing had changed for them. Not yet, but everything had changed for me, and I intended to make sure that when the time came, they would understand exactly what that meant that evening. Something shifted in a way that was almost too subtle to notice unless you were looking for it. And I was looking for it. Every word, every movement, every glance carried meaning now. As we sat down for dinner, Ashley spoke more freely than usual, her tone light, but laced with an underlying confidence that had grown stronger over the past few days. She talked about contractors, about timelines, about how certain changes would make the house feel more modern, more efficient. And what struck me was not just what she said, but how she said it, as if the decisions had already been made, as if my agreement was assumed rather than requested. Daniel nodded along, occasionally adding small comments, reinforcing her ideas without ever once turning to include me, and I listened, quietly, carefully, allowing them to continue without interruption, because the more they spoke, the clearer their intentions became. At one point, Ashley mentioned needing to clear out some of the upstairs rooms, suggesting that it would be easier if unused spaces were reorganized sooner rather than later, and although she did not say it directly, the implication was obvious. She was already planning for a version of this house that did not include me. I set my fork down slowly, not to draw attention, but to steady my thoughts, because this was the moment I had been waiting for, not to act, but to confirm. To hear it clearly enough that there would be no doubt, no room for interpretation. Daniel glanced at me briefly, as if expecting some kind of reaction, but when I offered none, when I simply nodded once and returned to my meal, he seemed almost relieved, as though my silence validated their assumptions, as though it meant they could proceed without resistance. And that was when I understood the full extent of their mistake. They believed silence meant weakness. They believed restraint meant acceptance. And because of that belief, they were giving me everything I needed without realizing it. After dinner, Ashley pulled out a folder of her own, spreading papers across the table, sketches, estimates, notes, all carefully prepared, all pointing toward a future she had already begun to construct in her mind. She explained each detail with precision, outlining costs, timelines, even mentioning how certain changes would increase the overall value of the property. And Daniel listened attentively, asking practical questions, fully engaged in a plan that had never once been discussed with me beforehand. I stood up quietly and began clearing my place, not out of obligation, but because I had seen enough, heard enough. There was no longer any uncertainty, no lingering question about what they intended to do. And as I carried my plate to the kitchen, I caught a glimpse of their reflections in the window, sitting side by side, focused on their plans, completely unaware of the reality that stood just outside their understanding. I rinsed the dish slowly, listening to the steady flow of water, grounding myself in the moment, because I knew that what came next would require precision, not emotion. When I returned to the dining room, I did not sit back down. Instead, I paused just long enough to look at the papers spread across the table, to take in the full picture of what they believed was already theirs. And then I spoke, not loudly, not sharply, but with a calm that immediately shifted the air in the room. I said, "It is interesting how detailed your plans are." And for the first time that evening, both of them looked at me fully, Ashley's expression flickering with something that might have been surprise, Daniel's posture tightening slightly, as if he sensed that something had changed, and I let that moment settle. Because this was no longer about gathering information. This was about preparing to draw a line, one that they had not yet realized existed. And as I turned and walked away, leaving them in that quiet, uncertain pause, I knew that the next conversation we had would not follow the pattern they had grown comfortable with. Because this time, I would not be the one simply listening. The next morning carried a different kind of tension, not loud or obvious, but present in the way Ashley moved through the kitchen with sharper motions, in the way Daniel avoided lingering in any one place for too long, as if both of them had sensed that something had shifted the night before, even if they could not yet name it. I kept my routine unchanged, pouring coffee, setting the table, moving with the same calm precision I had maintained for days, because consistency was part of the illusion. I needed them to believe that nothing had changed, that I was still exactly where they expected me to be. And for a while it seemed to work. Ashley resumed her quiet control over the space, opening cabinets, adjusting things that did not belong to her to adjust, making small remarks about organizing, about efficiency, about how certain areas of the house could be better utilized, each comment layered with assumption, each action reinforcing the belief that she had already stepped into a role that was never hers to claim. Daniel lingered near the doorway, watching her with a kind of passive agreement that had become familiar, and when he finally spoke, it was to suggest that they might start moving things around sooner rather than later, that waiting would only delay progress. And I listened from the table, hands folded, eyes steady, taking in not just their words but the certainty behind them, because certainty makes people careless, and carelessness reveals truth more clearly than any confession. After breakfast, Ashley gathered a stack of papers again, more detailed this time, more finalized, placing them on the counter with a sense of ownership that would have seemed almost admirable if it were not so misplaced. She spoke about scheduling appointments, about bringing someone in to evaluate structural changes, about timelines that extended weeks into the future, all of it planned without a single acknowledgement of the one person whose consent was not optional. And still I said nothing, not because I had nothing to say, but because the moment had not yet arrived. I stood slowly, carried my cup to the sink, rinsed it with deliberate care, and turned off the water, letting the silence fill the space between us, because silence, when used correctly, has a way of making people reveal more than they intend. Ashley paused briefly, glancing in my direction, perhaps expecting a question, a challenge, something to push against. But when none came, she returned to her papers, her confidence settling back into place. And that was when I knew they had crossed the line without realizing it. Not a physical line, not one you could see, but a line of assumption. So complete that they no longer questioned it. And that was exactly where I needed them to be, because now there would be no ambiguity when the truth was placed in front of them. No room for misunderstanding. Only the clear contrast between what they believed and what actually was. I dried my hands slowly and turned to face them fully, not with urgency, not with anger, but with a calm that carried its own weight. And I let my gaze rest on the papers spread across the counter, on the plans that had been built without me, on the future they had already claimed as their own. And for a moment, I allowed the silence to stretch just long enough to make them aware of it, just long enough for them to look up and meet my eyes. And when they did, I saw it. The first hint of uncertainty, small but undeniable, and I held that moment carefully, because this was no longer about observing, no longer about gathering. This was the threshold between what had been assumed and what was about to be revealed. And as I reached for the folder I had kept hidden in plain sight, I understood that everything that followed would not need to be forced. It would simply need to be shown. I placed the folder gently on the table, not with force, not with urgency, but with a quiet certainty that immediately changed the air in the room. And for the first time since all of this began, neither Ashley nor Daniel spoke. They simply watched as I opened it slowly, turning the pages with deliberate care, allowing the sound of paper against wood to fill the silence. Because moments like this are not rushed, they are allowed to unfold. I did not look at them right away. I let the weight of what I held settle into the space between us, and then I said, in the same calm tone I had used all morning, "It is interesting how much planning you have done without asking a single question." Ashley straightened slightly, her confidence still present but no longer effortless, while Daniel shifted his weight, his eyes moving between me and the documents as if trying to anticipate what was coming next. I turned one of the pages toward them, not pushing it across, just enough for them to see, and I continued, "You have been making decisions based on an assumption, and I understand why, because I allowed that assumption to exist." Ashley frowned, just slightly, her expression tightening as she glanced down at the page, her eyes scanning words she clearly did not expect to see. Legal terms, signatures, dates that predated her presence in this house. Daniel leaned forward now, his attention fully engaged, the certainty that had carried him through the past few days beginning to slip, and I let the silence stretch again, giving them time to process what they were looking at, because truth does not need to be forced. It simply needs to be clear. Finally, I looked up and met their eyes, one at a time, steady, unshaken, and I said, "This house was never transferred the way you believed it was." The words landed without drama, without raised voices, but their effect was immediate. Ashley's posture stiffened, her fingers tightening slightly around the edge of the table, while Daniel's expression shifted into something closer to realization, something he had been avoiding now standing directly in front of him. I continued before either of them could speak, not to overwhelm them, but to ensure there was no confusion. There are conditions in place, protections that cannot be changed without my consent, and more importantly, authority that has not been where you assumed it was. Ashley shook her head slightly, as if trying to dismiss what she was hearing, but her voice did not come right away, because certainty, once shaken, does not recover instantly. Daniel finally spoke, his tone quieter than I had ever heard it, asking what exactly I meant, and I answered simply, "I mean that. Everything you have been planning depends on approval you do not have." The room fell silent again, but this time it was not the same silence as before. It was heavier, grounded in something undeniable. Ashley looked back down at the papers, her earlier confidence replaced by careful calculation, as if she were trying to find a way around what was written in front of her, while Daniel leaned back slightly, his shoulders no longer relaxed, his certainty replaced by a growing awareness of the situation they had placed themselves in. I closed the folder gently, not as an ending, but as a statement that everything that needed to be said had already been said, and then I added, my voice still calm, still steady, "You called me something the other night." I paused just long enough for them to remember, for the words to echo in their own minds, and then I finished. But it seems the situation is not quite what you thought it was. Neither of them responded immediately, because there was nothing to argue with, nothing to dismiss, only the clear reality of what they had overlooked, and I stood there for a moment longer, not waiting for an apology, not expecting one, but allowing the truth to settle fully into the space we all shared, because from this point forward, nothing would be based on assumption again, and for the first time in a long while, I was not the one being quietly pushed aside. I was the one standing firmly in place, exactly where I had always been meant to be.